Welcome, everyone.
Okay. Appreciate you being here. I think I'm going to get us started. Looks like numbers have steadied. So, yeah, welcome to the Varley Art Gallery's Lunch and Learn series. These Lunch and Learns are generously sponsored by the Varley Mackay Art Foundation and TD Bank Group. Without them, these talks would not be possible. This webinar is being recorded, just a note. You also have the option to turn on or off the closed captioning feature. And we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you may have throughout the talk. We have left some time at the end to answer those questions for you. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the land that we are on. Let me pull up that screen for you. Actually, I think I might leave it here. So I will say, I'd like to acknowledge the communities in Circle, the north, west, south, and eastern directions, and the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Seneca, Chippewa, and the current treaty holders of Mississaugas of the Credit people. We share the responsibility with the caretakers of this land to ensure the dish is never empty and to restore relationships that are based on peace, friendship, and trust. We are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. Land acknowledgements are just a small piece that we can do, but I encourage you to go to native-land.ca to learn about the land that you live on. Now, joining us today, we have Sameer Farooq. Sameer Farooq is a Canadian artist of Pakistani and Ugandan Indian descent, born in Cape Breton and based in Toronto. His work has been exhibited widely in Canada and internationally, including the Venice Biennale of Architecture, the Aga Khan Museum, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Farouk's practice often explores themes of community, collaboration, and cultural exchange. We're very pleased to welcome you today, Sameer, to share more about your work and your practice. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and ask you to share yours.
Okay,
I am going to disappear now, but I'm not very far if you need me.
great. And you can see my screen, right, Rachel?
Yes, it looks
Okay,
great.
fantastic. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Lunch and Learn. I am neither lunching or learning. I'm going to be talking for the next 30 to 40 minutes, and then I'll be uh, shoving food down my mouth afterwards. So that is the how generous I am as a speaker. But it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. This show at the Varley Art Gallery has been such a true delight. The community in Markham has shown up in ways that were very surprising to me. The opening was rammed, and I received a lot of wonderful questions from people in the audience. It's such an incredible community that is supporting the visual arts, and I'm just really, really happy to be a part of it now. So what I'm going to be speaking about is my specific exhibition at the Varley Art Gallery, which is a touring show called The Fairest Order in the World. This show has been initiated by the Dalhousie Art Gallery in Halifax, my home province, and has then moved on to the McMaster Art Museum in Hamilton, the Musée d'Art de Joliette in Quebec. It and It then has moved on to the Varley, and it will be in two more places after this, at the Windsor Essex Gallery and at the Mackenzie in Regina. So it's incredible to have such a rich tour of the show. So a great deal of my work has been about building fictional museums fueled by the sort of circuitous pathways that objects and artifacts make their way into our institutions. Um, I I've really taken a great interest in the way that museums have built narratives around who we are as people on Earth. And I'm interested in looking at the blind spots of what museums can do. And in museums, I'm really speaking about encyclopedic museums, anthropology museums, sort of museums that claim to represent the entirety of sort of human experience. For over 20 years, I've been working in museums across the globe, including in Istanbul, Morocco, throughout Europe and Asia. Um, and I've been collecting a huge amount of archive, making a huge personal archive of specific narrative strategies and display strategies within these museums. So this show is really about that. So the show in question is called The Fairest Order in the World, and it brings together about, I would say, 7 years of work into one show. And the work again hovers around these ideas of museum collections, repatriation, repair, and the rehabilitation of museums. Um, so, in talking about this large show, I wanted to make three proposals about how we can think about the future of museums and the collections within them. And I also want to invite you to think about your own relationship to museums. I would be curious to think for you to let me know if you feel that these broad encyclopedic museums like the ROM in Toronto, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, if these institutions should continue to exist, should they be burned to the ground and everything be returned? Or can we figure out other more nuanced ways of working within these collections as visitors and as artists? And I think you can probably guess my opinion on that already. So, the overall layout of the show really evokes the familiar side of a museum. However, one quickly learns that things are not appearing as how they seem. What I want you to notice is that nothing is hung on the walls in my exhibitions. Everything is hung on scaffolding, dollies, skids, or these easels I've constructed. And the whole idea is that the physical arrangement of this exhibition really emphasizes the fluidity of thought necessary to shift these entrenched practices we have in building museums. Um, what I want to what I want you to notice is that my perspective of the role of belongings in museums is that they're very much in a process of disappearing and becoming. I want us to really think about the way belongings exist outside of the museum walls in a process of cohering and breaking apart and cohering back together again. And I would like to suggest that we should look at museums as having that potential to evoke that velocity among our belongings. Because I would ultimately like to undo the state of permanent hold that these objects are in. What's interesting is that museum time becomes a real aspect um, in this exhibition. When belongings enter a museum, they often enter into a frozen state. And as an artist, I really was interested in understanding how we could unfreeze these objects and allow them to have some sort of agency. So the first series, basically this exhibition is divided into two sections. The first is really about really imagining um, what would it look like for objects to leave these museums? What could the rematriation of objects look like? So I started this in this series of photographs called the Repatriation series, where I took this large archive of images I've taken from museums across the world and wanted to imagine what a language of exit would look like. So what's interesting in these cases is that it really gestures towards a language of imperial logic. What shadows, scuffs, symmetries, and holes are left behind when the object leaves. So in a way, I'm shifting the view from, looking at the exact objects of the field of study and looking at the display mechanisms to really understand the imperial powers that took hold of the narratives and how they would like the public to understand these belongings. Um, so in these photographs, I was really interested in coming up with this idea of what could a language of exit look like. So I printed out these large photographs of display cases from museums, and I cut out the images and placed them on a piece of plexiglass, creating a separate plane. And then I attached the plexiglass to a dolly and physically pulled the objects away from the background. So basically, I was trying to enact the form of repatriation that I could in my own studio. And what I found fascinating was in all of these images, when we talk about repatriation as scholars or as journalists, we often talk about the violence of theft or the politics of display. But as an artist, what came up in this language of exit to me was fascinating. Instead, I would use the words shimmer, undulation, streaming, ghosts, shadows, emergent forms. So something else is, when I'm enacting this process of exit, something else is happening visually. Um, it's as it's as though there's almost a language of liberation. Um, the language of exit feels almost as though, at least through photography, that this moment of lightness and ethereality is being brought into the mix. Um, I just want to make the point that the language shifted when I started making it from writing about repatriation to actually enacting the process. This image is from the ROM, and it's these two seated Buddhas that turn into these almost ghost-like figures when they're leaving their displays. And then the second place where I experimented with this repatriation activity was through these large plaster sculptures that I um, constructed. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to cast objects and sort of remove them from their display cases, almost as though I was translating this gesture of exit into a solid form. So basically, what I was trying to do was mold the negative space and really breathe air around the objects, revealing the lines left from the departed belongings. So these monolithic sculptures really ask us to spend time with the absences that they conjure. So what was interesting about this work was that unlike the photographs, you have this sort of punched out holes, these very stark shadows that fill in the gaps of what once was lost. So I think the language in these plaster casts was quite different from the sculptures. Um, it was also a little bit in the field of animation. As you can see here, these goblets are leaving the display case by radiating outward in a sort of diagonal way. Other times they float upward, but because it's in plaster, I sort of almost like a painting, I had to repeat the object moving to sort of show its pathway. Whereas in the photographs, the long exposure of the photographs and pulling it through space did the work for me. Um, so we get to my first proposal here, which is in order for true reconciliation, we must learn how to grieve. So institutions, such as museums, need to develop protocols and practices for dealing with loss. So aside from, um, the general state of things, perishability or things breaking, disappearing and returning to the earth. Calls for repatriation really ask us to deal with the absence of what is left behind. And I think as artists, we can propose more poetic ways of dealing with these absent spaces, thus shepherding museums into new ways of working with their collections. I think there's a lot of potential in choreographing and re-choreographing these entrenched collections. My second proposal is the question, what purpose can the emptied museum serve? So once all of the objects have left the museum, how can we repurpose these emptied cavernous spaces? And so this exhibition really asks us to imagine how we can begin to think about the museum as a slowed down space for sensing and repair, as opposed to being a symbol of imperial violence. So I was really touched by this quote by Massimiliano Gioni, who was the curator of the Il Palazzo Enciclopedio ver, theme of the Venice Biennale a number of years ago. And he says, besieged are we by the profusion of images that characterize our present. We might be tempted to close our eyes, only to realize that pictures have always been swarming behind our eyelids. So, this, as an artist, I found this quote very evocative because I want to really invite us to envision what the museum may become if it turns into a process of sensing. And in a way, the second part of this exhibition is really about creating objects through different senses and really proposing an artistic remaking of the museum through using the senses. And to me, um, this is really a proposal to museums around um, like the mechanics of restitution, what museums may shift to collect and document, and what kind of experiences they could nurture. So the first series of works in this sort of reimagining or sensing through the museum is called 24 Affections. They're a series of monoprints made on the press. And they took inspiration from these Tantra paintings from Rajasthan in India. So I came across these really fascinating paintings that often would be created by a guru and given to their disciple. So the guru would make these simple geometric forms on found pieces of paper and then give them to the disciple to um, pin on their meditation chamber wall and study as a form of meditation. So what's interesting about this is that we learn that artworks can really become a support for mindfulness and a support for sort of internal transformation, as opposed to something to be collected, consumed, and valued. So when the disciple would be walking on the street or taking the bus, they could recall this painting as a form of meditation and use it as a support to a sort of internal daily practice. So I found this a really interesting proposal that we don't just look at artworks as external to us, external aesthetic objects, but they really come from us and through our senses. So I embarked on a series of meditation prints where for 3 years I tried a lot of different modalities of meditation, including movement. I attended a intuition training course from a disciple from the Berkeley Psychic School. I worked with various yoga modalities and visualization exercises. And I came up with a sort of modality that involved a lot of sort of repetitive movement. Um, where I was trying to evoke images that would appear in my mind's eye. So basically, I was meditating with movement and almost waiting for an image, an object, or language to drop. So in these images, when I would come out of a period of meditation, I would record what I would see into my phone. And then I transcribed these visions on paper. And then I worked with a master printmaker here in Toronto named Pamela Dodds. And together we would recreate these images in print. So in a way, I wanted to propose that the belongings that could enter the halls of the museum could really become about our internal archives. So rather than seeing with the eyes open and grabbing everything we could grab from the countries that we have power over, my proposal was to collect with the eyes closed. What images, objects, and language do we already hold and that we can offer as new deposits into the museum? And then a part of this work was also to invite the poet Jared Stanley to respond to the images that he saw um, through my meditation. So I provided him with images of these prints, and then I asked him to take every liberty that he had to create museum, like these expanded museum labels about what he was seeing in these images. Um, so in a way, I'm also proposing that we can move away from a more scientific description of artworks and really enter into a more lyrical lens as we, work within these display mechanisms. So as I'm sure many of you've seen at visiting the exhibition at the Varley, these appear on the reverse of these glass and concrete easels that were created to show the work. And these glass and concrete easels were also taken from Lina Bobardi, who is an incredible architect and who had designed a display mechanism in a museum in Sao Paulo. Um, so what you can also see in my exhibition is that I've nodded to a lot of museum display furniture and have sort of turned it on its head by putting in, rather than putting collected works, I've put in works that come from my own internal archive. Um, the other works that are in this second half of like evoking images and objects are these iterative ceramic sculptures. So what you see here are these ceramic works that have like a flat bottom and they're like pointing upward. And this was actually one of the first images I saw in meditation. And at the same time, I was grappling with this plinth that I saw at the Egyptian Museum, which I really loved. And so, in order to bring museum practice and this sort of internal collecting together, I repeated and repeated and repeated this object over and over and over again, both as a way to populate this plinth, but also as a way of truly, you know, resolving what this form was. Why did it come? Why did it appear to me in a meditation? What does it mean? And it's very interesting with any of these images or objects when I bring them to other people, and in fact, maybe you're having the same experience. They recognize these objects and images, they've seen them before, and I think this notion of there's a French word, the imaginaire. What do we all hold together as a society? I think this sort of comes to the front when we think about um, these objects. So, a friend of mine suggested that this was the Greek omphalos, which is sort of like a cornerstone that is placed at the beginning of a village in ancient Greece, and the town would be created around it. It means navel of the earth, so it's sort of it connects the earth to the heavens because the form points upward. Um, so to me, it was surprising that, you know, this form appeared. Um, in a more down to earth way, I really look at this work as being um, a sort of a representation of my body over time. You could see my hand in the work, you can see my breath in the work. Um, so again, we have this notion of the senses appearing again within a more traditional museum display. And I also see it as like a documentary of the ceramic studio I was working in at the time. These were sort of glaze techniques that they had available. In the other version, it was the color scape was similar to the other ceramic studio I was working in. So I'm really interested in being affected by sight and really allowing what materials are available to form my own practice. I want to be very porous in that way. Um, so we also have this iterative ceramic work, which are 700 slip cast onions. And they're arranged in a way that also looks like the human breath. They rise and they fall. And I think that's very much me putting the maker back into the exhibition. So here you can see an image of it at the Varley. And I think what's interesting about this work is that it was another image that came to me during a meditation. I suddenly, while I was doing one of these meditations, this unfurling onion appeared in front of my eyes, and the petals just kept opening and opening and opening. So I was very curious to follow that into a sculptural form and bring it onto this sort of floating museum display, this sort of stepped display. Um, And speaking with people, I wasn't quite sure why this form was appearing to me, but speaking to people, they've interpreted it in an interesting way. It's often seen as a key element that has been left out of the narrative of museums. So the onion is something that we touch, we hold, we cry over, we cook with almost every day. It's like the beginning of almost every recipe worldwide. Chop an onion. Yet something as fundamental and as basic as an onion never quite makes it into our museum collections because of security of other objects, because of, destroying private property, because of perishability, mold, smell. But the humble onion is such an important part of our human history. And to me, at least, I find it shocking that it is often left out. Um, as many of you know, I also work with bread a lot, and I think that has a very similar impetus in that these things that are so fundamental to human experience and survival often get left out of the historical record. In this show, there's also these series of works called the Gandhara images, the Gandhara series, I should say. And so these also take on the task of um, museum time. So, in a way, objects that enter into museums are often frozen in time. They stop being in relationship with the other objects around them. So when I was visiting the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the Taxila Museum in Pakistan, I came across these incredible Gandharan Buddhist objects. And what is unique about these Gandharan Buddhist objects are that they really were products of migration and products of the migration of ideas across the Silk Road. So, as you can see in these Buddhist heads, they don't just look like South Asian, Chinese, South Indian, these areas, Central Asian, every region has a very specific, like every Buddha has a very specific face. The Gandharan Buddhas really took ideas that traveled from the Greco-Roman Empire and moved across the Silk Road, and they reached these stonemasons in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and these stonemasons were affected by the hair, the figurines, the shape of the nose, the shape of the face of these European figurines, and they combine them with South Asian features and Central Asian features. So to me, this was groundbreaking because it shows that objects can hold multiple truths. Often museums try to relegate an object or a belonging to a singular place, but the Gandharan Buddhas show that objects are in a constant state of becoming. So in this work, I wanted to exaggerate that constant state of becoming and try to imagine what other things in this Buddha head's life did it come across. So in this image, there are oranges from the orange grove that was over the Buddha head when they found it in the archaeological dig. There's the ham and cheese sandwich of the conservator who was eating the sandwich while she was working on restoring the Buddha head. There's the schist stone that the Buddha head was carved out of. There's the museum label that described the Buddha head probably 1,000 years after it was discovered. The gloved hand of the conservator. So I'm trying to imagine like these objects being in a constant state of becoming and really showing through the scanner, um, like trying to bring these edges together. I mean, here we have like the Dunkin' Donut I was carrying in my pocket in the Peshawar Museum when I came across this Gandhara Buddhist head mixed with different paraphernalia from the conservation lab. So, in a way, I'm trying to expand the notion of time that these objects have sat within. I also think it's kind of funny that, through this work, I can communicate that there is indeed Dunkin' Donuts in Pakistan, which I don't think a lot of people realize. Um, so that's the Gandhara series. And I really use the scanner because it's sort of the medium of border crossing. Our faces are scanned, our passports are scanned. So it seemed like a really great tool to use when thinking about these objects passing through time and place. I also had the opportunity to show this work at a biennial in Tunisia called the Zhao Biennial, and I just include an image here just to show sort of how malleable my work can become. In this way, it was in a large outdoor art exhibition on this scaffolding, and I sort of divided it up almost as though the image was being cut up in a scanner and rejoined again. So the final piece in this exhibition is a film called The Museum Visits a Therapist. It's 20 minutes long, and I invite you to visit the Varley if you haven't to spend some time with it. The show is up until May, so there's still plenty of time to experience the exhibition. Um, so the museum visits a therapist is um, a film that I made with the artist Miriam Linschoten in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, which is one of these large encyclopedic museums. We spent a few years just observing how workers would you know, um, how they would be in the museum, and in an attempt to try to figure out like what type of work we wanted to make of this place. So I have a small clip that I can show you.
Ik was een strijder. Ik was een winnaar. Ik wou de beste zijn. En nu ben ik ben erg moe. En toch slaap ik niet goed. Ik heb vaak nachtmerries.
Heb je een idee hoe lang dit al speelt?
Nou, ik denk sinds mijn missie in Nieuw-Guinea.
So what you can see here is that we imagine the museum in a session with a psychotherapist. And what we wanted to do is see if we could take a traditional sort of method of rehabilitation and apply it to the colonial imperial museum. So, what we began to see in all of our research at the Tropen Museum were various patterns, hands trembling, repetitive gestures such as dusting, polishing, misting, perfectionism and control, um, an exactitude of arranging things, hoarding. And what we began to notice is that what was emerging is that these actions were very similar to the actions of obsessive compulsive disorders and how they were described for those experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. So we began to see the museum very much in the same domain. For an institution like the Tropen Museum that has accumulated over 150,000 objects, largely through theft, it can be seen as a kind of hoarding. And together with an obsession with climate control, security, um, they create an atmosphere of complete control. So what we wanted to do was imagine what a fictional conversation would be between the museum and a therapist in an attempt to be a bit generous toward, how would the museum speak of its experience holding all of this stolen objects and what effect has it had on the body of the museum? So we made the script out of fragments from journals, interviews, and letters from three different sources. Dutch veterans who had worked um, in Papua, which many of the artifacts in the Tropen Museum come from. Missionaries who had also worked in the region, and collectors who were the direct link between the Tropen Museum and the region. And the slide we have now is from a letter from the director of the Tropen Museum to one of the collectors, instructing them to grab everything they could grab from the region. And this was done the collection was largely built between 1959 and 1962 when the Dutch were losing control over the region. So what we wanted to do was use different sort of therapeutic methods, EMDR treatment, sounds, flashbacks, and trying to get the viewer into a therapeutic session with the museum. And after so many months of observation, we really understood the museum space as having concentric circles of grief and trauma passed from the initial theft to the ultimate, gestures of the workers from the museum. So while this violent history has become detached from the collection over the centuries, the evidence of the theft and the anxiety which gave rise to the museum are written all over the architecture and within the gestures of the museum workers. So, this film really asks, what are our other ways of rehabilitating these institutions? So I'll end here. And I just, I want to really come back to this one question that I had around um, do we think museums should cease to exist because of their very dubious past? And through my work, I would like to really propose a middle path. Is it possible to rehabilitate and repurpose these spaces and really turn them into spaces of discovery, curiosity, and repair? So I will end there and I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm open to questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sameer. That was really wonderful. I find the more time I spend in the space, the more I discover and I learn not only about the works, but about how I'm viewing the works and what it means to visit a museum as well. So if you haven't done so already, please get out to the Varley Art Gallery. The exhibition Sameer Farooq, The Fairest Order of the World, is on display until May 3rd. So please come out and check that out if you haven't already. And that's Sameer Farooq, The Fairest Order in the World, curated by Mona Filip. So I'm going to open it up now to our audience. We've got quite a few people joining us today, so thank you again for being here. If you have any questions, please use that Q&A box at the bottom to put those in, and we are happy to take your questions now. I know people are a little shy to start off. Don't be shy. We love questions here. Sameer is ready. And we do have
Nice.
one coming in.
Yeah.
So the question is, when you refer to Hercules, Heraclitus, thank you,
Yeah.
and how the fairest order in the world is a heap of random sweepings, say the onion display, which I suppose represents the ordinary in place of the repatriated items. But shouldn't the onions be placed in a random heaping versus a meticulously choreographed assembly?
Great question. So, thank you for bringing up the title of the show because I forgot to mention it. So, the title of the show comes from a Heraclitus quote, which is the fairest order in the world is a heap of random sweepings. And what I love about this quote is that it really gets us to question the calcified narratives that our institutions are putting forth, and really see the world as the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh would say, um, in a state of intra-being, that everything is really connected with everything else, and in order for one thing to survive in the world, it needs, everything else around it to survive. So, I'm a firm believer that, things come together in certain formations and then need to break apart and form in other, formulations through different spaces. So the the question about could the form, why is the form so formal? Why is everything still, very much in a taxonomic display? And I think that's a good question and a great critique. Um, what I would say is I wanted to create a balance between the viewer feeling like they were still within a traditional museum space, and I wanted to use sort of these things like the stepped plinth, which I saw at the Egyptian Museum, or these um, cement and plexi stands that Lina Bobardi, developed in order to situate the viewer like firmly within this museum so that I could within the traditional museum, so my work would have some tension to rub up against. And I feel like if I had pushed it further and enacted like, just chaos or these piles of things, um, we wouldn't have had the sort of the character or the subject of the museum still in in the display. I think it would have looked like a much more abstracted exhibition. With that being said, as I'm growing as an artist, I am loosening up a lot in that way. With my recent exhibition, the Flatbread Library, the bread displays really start to weave together like a textile piece and really push this notion of the edges sort of beginning to blur. I think also with the Gandhara series on the scanner, you begin to see this desire to not have things so neat and tidy. So it's a great observation. I think the earlier work is definitely still hanging on to those conventions of the museum, but then as it develops, I think I loosen up, hopefully, as an artist, and hopefully I'll continue to loosen up.
Thank you for that. You mentioned the bread display, and we have a question about that. Somebody saw it in Toronto and was wondering if it was also ceramic like your onions at the Varley or actual bread preserved in some way, if you can talk to that.
Yeah, so the flatbread library was actual bread, which was quite a decision. I thought I would remake all the bread in ceramics, but then I learned that the skill that all of these diasporic bakers were bringing to the table was beyond what I could learn, in a short period of time. So I decided to use the actual breads, and they were dried, flattened, and then coated in like an acrylic medium and shellac in order to make them stable for exhibition. Although I do have a flatbread library in development for New York, an outdoor exhibition in New York, and I'm considering maybe casting them, but
Hmm,
you do lose a lot of detail, and I think using the original object was really the best way to go.
perfect. No question, but Renuka wanted to say how much they loved this presentation and the depth of thoughtfulness in your work. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anuka. I appreciate it.
And another one, thank you for the sensitive and accessible introduction to this project. I would love to know how you navigate expectations of longevity and permanence that underwrite various museum efforts. Is entropy welcome explicitly or surreptitiously in your making?
Great. Thank you, Crystal.
These are
And
great
I'm
questions.
very excited to bring this exhibition to your institution in about a year's time at the Mackenzie in Regina, Saskatchewan. So um, I think notions of ephemerality and perishability are some of the largest challenges to museum collections and their claim of representing a a fulsome view of humanity. So I feel like something has got to shift. So either um, we welcome the perishable and the ephemeral into our collections in various ways, whether it's through, allow like allowing unstable elements, into museums and allowing for controlled decay, being okay with things disintegrating and only being available for some time. Again, sort of dealing with grief. I think museums have adopted a lot of like attitude from like this French notions of conservation that things should be looking the same and kept in the same state, for centuries. And I think there's a lot of debates among conservators around controlled decay or allowing things to return to the earth. Um, so, there's that side of things, thinking through how we can envelop perishability and ephemerality into our museums. Or maybe the other way is to not claim, to really work with museums to talk about the limitations of their collections, to let viewers know that this is not representative of human history or a specific, cultural experience, because we're not considering food at all, or performance, sound, smell, movement. There's like
Mhm.
major things. So, I think that can happen at both ends of the spectrum. I would be really interested to figure out how we could incorporate, things like, bread or onions into historical museums. My solution has been to um, sort of calcify them, fossilize them, but I'm sure there are better ways. Yeah, it would be fun to think through this with you. Yeah.
Okay, June has a question. There are many museums in the UK, for example, that are returning stolen artifacts. There will be huge empty spaces to fill. Should they be repurposed for some form of visual art? I love your ideas in this exhibition.
Great. Thank you, June. So, I'm actually heading to the UK for the month of April, and I'll be working with Dan Hicks from the Pitt Rivers Museum, who's one of the foremost advocates for sort of the return of especially the Benin bronzes from British collections, back to their original kingdom. And so, I think what's yeah, to answer your question, um, the what will happen is that there'll be these empty spaces within the museums to fill. So I think there'll be some empty spaces, and I think those spaces can give especially practicing artists the opportunity to think through how they want to fill them. And in my way, I think it's important to really have a long period of reflecting on the spaces. What are the scuffs and the imprints and the shadows left behind? And what is the gravity of that, of like returning something that had been held for 100 years and return back. So I think that I would go with a more contemplative um process, and that's very easy and very cost effective for museums to do because they just have to leave things as they are, as almost these like skeletons of something that used to be. But also, calls for repatriation and objects, every object has its own story, and that's why repatriation takes such a long time. So some communities want their objects to stay within these museums.
Mhm.
Some want purpose-built uh, spaces for their belongings. I know in Vancouver, I believe the Museum of Anthropology may have a purpose-built museum for indigenous belongings that certain communities can only visit, and they can also take out the objects for ceremonial use. So every object sort of has its own demand. Some places don't exist anymore where objects were taken. So, some will end up on more unstable ground. So it's maybe better to be um, within a secure location. So it's a very complicated area, and the more I dive into it, the more I realize that the answer is that there should be really multiple forms of working with these objects. But as a contemporary artist, I think it's a very rich area to really grapple with the blind spots of these institutions and push them to do better.
How nice would it be to ask the objects themselves what they would like?
Yeah. People are doing that. People are doing that. Yeah, the one of the most interesting cases is at the Agnes Etherington Art Center that I've come across. They have a indigenous curator and an African curator who are in charge of caring for their indigenous and African collections. And
Mhm.
they're doing a lot of really interesting experimental and really like community-led um, caretaking of these objects. And I imagine as the new Agnes Etherington Museum gets unveiled next fall, I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion around the work they're doing. So I would really pay attention to that. They're in Kingston, Ontario, as a part of Queen's University.
Thank you. I will now pay attention to what they're up to when they
Mhm.
reopen. So we have time for one last question. This one is from Jordan, who says, "Thank you for answering my first question. Would you say your exhibition is antithetical to Alper's museum effect? And if you need context, are you familiar with Alper's museum effect?"
Not that well. So, mm,
We
so
are
good
just
point.
reading through the
Yeah.
definition provided by Jordan. Thank you for providing that.
It's in, yeah. I'm just gonna copy and paste that into my own text document because I want to really think about it after we're done. Thank you so much for sending this. I think just in the short time we have available to get into this, what it evokes from me is that I think what I'm trying to do, and maybe this is sort of the tone of this comment, is that I'm really trying to understand how we can unfreeze objects as they enter the threshold of museums and enter into this zone called museum time. And so, as you say, like the museum creates new and artificial contexts for the objects and often overshadowing the object's original meaning. Um, for me, I think the way forward to really like displaying our cultural heritage is really listening to what the objects are trying to evoke from the viewer. So I've had the chance of doing it in the case of the Gandharan objects. And what they're trying to say is that I am created by many things. I m- I am a single entity that holds multiple histories and multiple realities. So how could we go about imagining redesigning an encyclopedic museum display based on that? Maybe we take a different notion of time and rhythm and apply it to ordering objects in the museum. So perhaps Gandharan Buddhist objects are next to Korean ceramics because both of them have like a spiraling notion of time. Or, maybe the curve of you know, an urn meets like the cheek of a Roman bust because formally the hand of both makers at that moment in that simultaneous moment created a similar shape. So I'm really interested in like finding these other to keep finding these adjacencies between objects and simultaneities so we can sort of begin to like unhinge the museum from itself and begin to create multiple narratives for things to collide and for new stories and new collaborations to to yeah, to emerge from these spaces. That would be very exciting, but also quite expensive, I'm sure, for museums. Um, yeah, anyway, thank you for these incredible questions. I'm gonna really take them with me into my afternoon. I'm very much continuing in this line of thinking from my residency in the UK in April, so I really appreciate being prodded in these ways.
Amazing. Well, thank you for your time, Sameer, today, for answering those questions and for that amazing presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're so glad you could make it. We are hosting more lunch and learns along with other programs that are exhibition related. You can visit our website, varleyartgallery.ca, for more information and to stay up to date with what we're up to. So thank you. And with that, I will say goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.